Hello, my name's Camille Reyes. For a long time, I was the one they whispered about the girl who embarrassed the family. When a private video leaked, they didn't ask if I was okay. They just locked the doors and left my clothes on the porch. My brother rose to power while I disappeared. But 15 years later, I walked into his courtroom, and when he looked up and said, "You're the governor," I realized I didn't need their approval to rise. I just needed to stop waiting for it. When I stepped through the front door of the Race estate that Sunday evening, I knew something had shifted. The lights were warm, the air smelled of lemon oil and polished wood. But the silence was surgical. No greeting, no music. Just the steady tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway, counting down, a moment I hadn't yet recognized as the end of my life as their daughter. I passed the living room. CNN played silently on the flat screen above the fireplace. Isabella's face, all crisp suits and conviction framed, beside a news ticker that read, "District Attorney Reyes cracks down on organized crime." That was my sister's gift. Making chaos look like justice. Making betrayal look like pride. In the dining room, Richard sat at the head of the long mahogany table, his military shoulders stiff a glass of red wine untouched. Helen stood behind him, folding linen napkins with the precision of someone terrified of noise. Anthony leaned against the doorframe, a glass of scotch in hand, eyes fixed on his phone, then on me. I set my duffel bag by the wall. "Hi." No one responded. I cleared my throat. "Is this about the video?" Anthony's mouth curled, slow and deliberate. "You really think we'd need to call a family meeting over something like that?" Richard stood. "Sit." I didn't. I watched Helen's fingers twitch. "She's been trending for 3 days," Anthony said, gesturing lazily at the screen. "No one even watches the news anymore. They just click replay." I turned to Richard. "It wasn't mine. I didn't post it. You didn't stop it." He barked. "You didn't prevent it. That's the same thing." I could feel the room spinning in reverse. "He took it without my consent." You were there." His voice was ice with gravel beneath. "You were in that room, in that video. You let that man humiliate our name." It wasn't the name he violated. I could barely hear my own voice. It was me. Richard didn't blink. He walked around the table, opened the drawer of the buffet, pulled out a folder. My transcript. My graduation certificate. My scholarship letter from UT Austin. He tossed it on the ground like trash that had finally served its use. "You want to live like garbage. Do it without my name, without my roof, and without my money." Helen stepped back. Her rosary was clenched so tight around her fingers it cut faint red lines into her skin. She didn't say a word. Didn't even meet my eyes. "Mom." Silence. I turned to Anthony. "You believe this? You of all people?" He smiled, slow, polished. "I believe timing matters. Yours was unfortunate." I remember my hands shaking as I picked up the folder off the floor. Pages bent a corner torn. My diploma had my name embossed in gold. Camille Teresa Reyes. No one said goodbye. The maid Louisa came down with a duffel bag. She didn't meet my gaze either, just pressed the strap into my hand. Tucked inside was my old red backpack and a B-bus ticket to Denver departure, 10:15 p.m. Anthony followed me to the foyer. "I'll give you one piece of advice," he said. "Don't make this worse than it already is. The internet forgets. Eventually." I turned. My mouth was dry. "It won't forget you." He laughed. "I didn't show up on camera. I walked out without slamming the door. I wanted to, but slamming doors means you're still trying to be heard." I wasn't. The night was thick with Texas heat. Crickets screeched like alarms. The air clung to my skin like shame. At the bus terminal, I sat in the last row behind a mother and 2 kids who smelled like peanut butter and exhaustion. The driver closed the doors. The world lurched forward. I reached into my backpack and pulled out the notebook, the one I'd kept since 8th grade. It had doodles of my mother's earrings, song lyrics, half-written poems, family recipes. The paper felt heavier than I remembered. Page by page, I tore them loose, folded, lit each corner with the bus bathroom lighter, watched them curl and blacken over the sink. The flame was hungry but slow. It didn't roar, it whispered. When it was done, I flushed the ashes, washed my hands, looked into the mirror. My eyes were rimmed red, my face pale. but I still looked like me. And that somehow made it worse. Back in my seat, I stared into the dark window, the outside world rushing by like a place I'd never belong to again. I pressed my fingers to the cold glass and whispered the only vow I knew how to make anymore. If I've been erased, I'll learn to become unforgettable. In Denver, no one knew my name. That's how I knew I was safe. The air burned in a way I hadn't felt before, dry, high-altitude cold that sliced through denim and memory. It was December 2009. I had been in the city for exactly 16 days. My last $20 bill was folded into the bottom of my left boot, and every breath came out in a fogged whisper, like it was trying to disappear before I could name it. I was renting half a cot in a women's shelter off Colfax Avenue. The mattress was thin, the blankets thinner. Some nights I laid sideways to make room for a woman with bruises under her eyes and a baby who only cried when she thought no one was listening. I didn't ask their names. They didn't ask mine. When the staff at the shelter handed me a clipboard and asked for ID, I hesitated. Then I wrote, Cam R. Not Camille, not Reyes, just a name that fit in the space I had left. It wasn't a lie. It was a survival version of the truth. By day, I poured coffee and memorized the faces of truckers who tipped well. Ethan's diner was the kind of place that hadn't been redecorated since Reagan, where the booths creaked and the waitresses didn't smile unless they meant it. Ethan himself was gruff, sun-worn, and skeptical of anyone under 30. He hired me anyway. In the afternoons, I cleaned a local medical clinic floors, sinks, biohazard bins. The hallways smelled like bleach and broken hope. Most of the staff didn't speak to me. I didn't expect them to. Nights, I typed insurance codes into a spreadsheet for a logistics firm I'd never set foot in. My boss was a voice through a headset, and my cubicle was a folding chair in the corner of the shelter's rec room. No one noticed me. I liked it that way. Then came Tuesday. It was the last shift at the clinic before the new year. Snow blew sideways against the building, rattling the glass. I had just dumped a mop bucket when I heard shouting in the front hallway. A woman stood near the reception desk, clutching a toddler on her hip. Her coat was torn, her knuckles red and raw. A security guard hovered over her, waving a stack of forms. Firma acqui, he barked. It's already processed, just sign. She shook her head wide-eyed. Her lips moved, but no words came out. Something split inside me. I stepped forward. She's not signing anything. The guard looked me up and down. Who the hell are you? She's not signing, I repeated. These forms are outdated. Your software hasn't processed them correctly. If you force this, it's coercion. It was a bluff. I had no idea what was in those papers. But I knew fear when I saw it. And I knew what silence tasted like when it curdled in your throat. The guard paused, muttered something into his walkie, and backed off. The woman didn't thank me. She just held her child tighter and cried into the little girl's jacket. Later that evening, as I was wiping down the staff lounge, Ethan appeared in the doorway. I hadn't known he even stopped by the clinic. You don't work here, he said. Cleaning crew, I replied, still scrubbing. He nodded slowly. I heard what you did. I didn't answer. Most people don't get involved. I'm not most people. A beat passed. Why step in? I looked at him. Because I've seen what silence does, and I won't be it anymore. He studied me for a long moment. Then he handed me a business card. We need someone like you, he said, not just to mop floors. That night, back in the shelter, I stared at the card for a long time. Ethan's nonprofit was called Praxis, a small advocacy group helping undocumented families navigate legal chaos. The idea of doing something that didn't erase me, it didn't feel real. But something had shifted. By the weekend, I was enrolled in night classes at the local community college Intro to Public Policy and Nonprofit Administration. I used a fake name, paid in cash, sat in the back, and never raised my hand. But I was there. I was learning again. And this time, it was for me. One evening, Ethan dropped a manila folder on the counter of the diner as I refilled the sugar canisters. Grant guidelines, he said. We're applying for state funds. If you're serious, start by reading these. I took the folder home, curled up on my bunk, and opened it with hands still smelling faintly of syrup. The first name listed under Grant Oversight Committee stopped me cold, Judge Anthony Reyes. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just stared at the name until it blurred. Then I turned the page. I cleaned toilets by day and wrote proposals by night. Somewhere between bleach and bureaucracy, I found my voice again. The nonprofit office smelled like damp drywall and old printer ink. The overhead lights flickered when the heater kicked in and the radiator hissed like it had secrets to tell. I took my spot each evening in the far corner, half a desk, a chipped coffee mug, and a refurbished Dell that wheezed when it booted. I wasn't on payroll. I wasn't even supposed to be in the room. My job title, if I'd had one, would have been whatever needs doing. But I knew how to listen. I knew how to sit quietly, take notes, and ask the questions that others skim past. I proposed a redesign for our refugee intake forms, a simple idea. Make it faster, less redundant, more accessible. I even translated sections into Spanish and Vietnamese, just in case. I submitted it to our program director, who smiled distractedly and filed it under something called Later. That version of Later never came. Most days I worked from open to lockup, wiping down conference tables no one thanked me for. But at night, after everyone else left, I stayed. I read through policy manuals and city grant conditions like they were sacred texts. The language was dry, but I could hear its pulse. Between the clauses and subclauses, I saw the architecture of power, and I wanted in. 1 week, panic hit the office like a winter draft. We'd misfiled compliance documents for a major state grant. If it wasn't fixed by Monday, we'd lose funding for 2 shelters and a legal clinic. People screamed. Phones rang off the hook. Desks were overturned in paper avalanches. While the others argued, I stayed late until dawn. I rewrote the compliance narrative line by line, aligning our program to the latest legislative revisions buried on page 73 of a 200-page PDF. I printed the corrected forms, highlighted the relevant clauses, cross-referenced citations. By the time the rest of the staff returned, I'd already emailed the updated packet to the state office. When they asked who fixed it, I didn't raise my hand, but Marion Bell noticed. She found me cleaning the hallway windows the next day. Tall, graceful, her voice, always just above a whisper, but somehow still the loudest in the room. "You read that grant code?" she asked. I nodded, twice. Why? Because no one else did. She smiled like she'd just found a missing puzzle piece. "Come with me." That night, I followed her into the bowels of the city council building, cheap carpet, sharp echoes, the kind of place that felt allergic to sunlight. We slipped into a folding chair row just as the Housing Budget Committee convened. The language flew fast: zoning caps, fiscal thresholds, line item audits. I recognized some terms, missed others, but the rhythm made sense. It was the sound of decisions wrapped in distance. Then they hit a section about public housing access for non-documented residents. Someone proposed a clause that would quietly reduce the radius of eligibility around immigrant-heavy neighborhoods. A surgical discrimination buried in paperwork. The room was half asleep until I leaned forward and whispered to Marion, "That clause violates 3 parts of the Fair Housing Act." She raised an eyebrow. "You sure? Section 804? Subsection B, line 14. A pause. Then she raised her hand. "I have a young analyst who would like to respond," she said. The chair nodded, barely glancing my way. I stood slowly. My voice was low but steady. I pointed out the discriminatory language, cited the relevant statute, and explained in plain terms how it would weaponize a zip code. Silence, then murmurs. A few council members shuffled papers. One frowned. Finally, the chair said, "We'll strike the clause for revision." I sat down, heart pounding like I'd just stolen something sacred. Outside, as we waited for Marion's rideshare, she handed me a city planning pamphlet. "Next week, they're reviewing a policy on emergency shelter zoning. You should be there." I nodded. "You belong in that room," she added. That night, I stayed late at the office again. Not to mop floors, but to draft a position paper on transit equity. I didn't notice the man in the back row until he stood up. He was tall, in a too-tight blazer, holding a notepad and a cheap recorder. A press badge swung lazily from his neck. He stared at me with narrowed eyes. Back at the office, I caught him near the coffee machine Googling something. He frowned. "Didn't she used to be?" He didn't finish the sentence. but I heard him. I didn't look back. I just walked out. They told me politics was for people with clean records. I told them to define clean. The flyer was black and white. No logo, no glossy slogan. Just my name, Camille R., and a line in bold, "Let the work speak first." That was how it began. Not with applause, not with a handshake from a mayor or a party chair, but with a folding table in the corner of a park near 5 Points and a clipboard held together with duct tape. "I'm not here to represent a party," I said into a $30 microphone. "I'm here to represent the people who've never been invited to the table, but who carry it on their backs every day." The crowd wasn't large, 20 people, maybe 30-some with strollers, a few with folded arms, but they stayed. And when I finished, they clapped. Marion was waiting by the water jugs. "You sounded like you'd done that before." I shook my head. "I just told the truth." She handed me a paper cup. "That's rarer than talent." We met in church basements after that, tiny rooms with plastic chairs and the smell of potluck stew in the walls. Ethan handled the spreadsheets. Marion taught me how to speak in bullet points. I wore the same gray coat to every event because it didn't distract from my words. The campaign had no colors, no paid consultants, just late-night meetings, borrowed printers, and volunteers who believed that even if we didn't win, we'd be seen, maybe for the first time. My name on the forms read Camille Reyes, but I never said it aloud. It sat like a knife on paper, sharp and weighty. Every interview, every voter meet and greet, I introduced myself simply as Camille. That was enough. The local press tried to dig. They found nothing. No marriage license, no criminal record, no school yearbooks under that name. One blogger speculated I might be a ghost candidate, a political plant, or deep cover operative. We laughed about that in Marion's kitchen over microwave tamales and cheap wine. Then came the community forum in Montbello. It was supposed to be a routine Q&A, an incumbent defending his seat against a field of long shots. I stood in my thrift store heels, flanked by volunteers folding campaign flyers. The auditorium buzzed with fluorescent light and city fatigue. Midway through, the incumbent leaned into the mic and smiled like a man who thought he'd already won. "We've all got pasts," he said, tone oiled with false benevolence. "But I'd just like to ask my opponent here, what exactly did you used to do before cleaning up community clinics?" He didn't say it outright. He didn't need to. The room stilled, heads turned. I didn't flinch. "I came from shadows," I said, calm and even. "But I didn't stay there. And I've spent every day since making sure others don't have to." A long pause, then someone clapped. Another. Then more. The next morning, a video clip surfaced on local news. A grainy 30 seconds. My face lit by overhead school lights, saying those words with hands folded and eyes steady. No fireworks, no denial. Just a woman owning silence like it was a weapon. The caption read, "A leader who doesn't flinch." By noon, it had 30,000 views. By evening, 300,000. But we barely had time to breathe. One of the campaign staffers, a college kid with too many tabs open on her laptop, burst into our makeshift office in a borrowed co-working space. "Ma'am," she said, breathless, "we just got a hit through our alert system." I looked up from drafting my housing equity proposal. "It's Judge Anthony Reyes," she said. "He's presiding over a deportation case in San Antonio. A minor. The family says the paperwork's fabricated. It's bad." The silence in the room was instant. My name still hovered in the air from the viral clip. And now his name had entered the story. Again. He used to speak for the law. Now the law had to pronounce my name out loud. I arrived at the courthouse 2 minutes before the hearing started. No entourage. No press notice. Just me in a charcoal coat and sunglasses that hid the years between now and then. The security guard barely glanced at my ID. That was the trick of power earned quietly when you wanted to slip in unnoticed. It didn't fight you. The courtroom was cold, all marble and restraint. Federal seals gleamed above the bench like commandments etched into stone. I took a seat in the back row, where shadows pooled and reporters rarely turned. The gallery was packed. Lawyers, journalists, advocates, everyone tense with expectation. But not because of me. Not yet. Anthony sat behind the bench like he had been born there, his robe pristine, his jaw as clenched as I remembered. It had been over a decade since I'd heard his voice, but it hadn't changed. Still that precise cadence. Still that clipped control. Authority dipped in ice. The defendant was a Honduran teenager, 16 maybe, charged with falsifying documents. But the inconsistencies were gaping and the deportation order was too clean, too fast. Activists had flagged it as judicial overreach. That's why the gallery was full. That's why I was here. Anthony called the session to order. The attorneys began. The room followed the usual rhythms, objections, affidavits, procedural language meant to keep truth at bay by wrapping it in formality. And then, during a witness cross-examination, it happened. Anthony paused. Mid-note. His pen hovered. He looked up. His eyes scanned the courtroom like they always had, methodical, commanding, just detached enough to remind you who held the gavel. Then he saw me. It was subtle at first. A flicker in his jaw, a shift in his spine. He blinked once, twice. A ripple passed through the room. A reporter leaned forward. A phone slipped from someone's hand and clattered to the floor. Then a whisper, barely contained. Wait. Is that the governor? Chairs creaked. Heads turned. The stenographer faltered, fingers missing beats. One photographer near the aisle whispered into his mic and raised his lens. Anthony froze. His gaze stayed on me longer than necessary. Longer than appropriate. His mouth parted slightly as if forming words he hadn't prepared to say. Then, slowly, deliberately, he leaned forward, eyes narrowed with disbelief. You're the governor. He didn't say it like a question. He said it like a reckoning, like someone who'd opened a locked door expecting a ghost and found a verdict instead. I didn't move. I didn't nod. I didn't smile. I just looked back, straight, unblinking. The room waited for a response, but I had none to give. That silence belonged to me. The lawyer coughed. A chair squeaked. Anthony blinked and cleared his throat, flipping a page that didn't need flipping. I stood. Quietly. No rush. Every head turned with me. Cameras followed, but no one dared speak. I walked out the way I came in silent, straight-backed scene. ChatGPT Danoy. They thought I came to interfere. I came to observe what fear looks like in a tailored robe. By the time I reached the hotel, the firestorm had already begun. My phone lit up in 10-second intervals, a blur of headlines, call attempts, and texts that pinged against the silence I carried out of that courtroom. I shut the door behind me and leaned against it, listening to the muffled city below. I didn't turn on the lights. Across the street from my 12th floor window, I could see the courthouse dome still and luminous in the dusk. From here, it looked small, contained like a theater that had just finished its act and dropped the curtain in shame. I sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing my coat. The news was moving faster than any campaign cycle. Governor Reyes stuns federal courtroom. Judge freezes mid-trial after unexpected visitor. Reyes family showdown. The headlines piled on like wet snow, heavy, relentless melting, just long enough to be replaced. My press secretary knocked once before entering, already mid-sentence. We need a unified statement, preferably by morning. Neutral tone deflecting personal connection, ideally no adjectives. I didn't look up. No, Camille, she said, softening. This doesn't look like an observation trip anymore. It looks like a message. Good, I replied. She blinked. You don't want to deny it. I didn't say anything. I was there. That's all. She hesitated, then slid a folder across the table. You should see this. Inside stills from the courtroom, my silhouette in the last row. Anthony mid-stare, lips parted. Commentary panels, talk show clips, tweets by the thousands. The narrative was writing itself and it wasn't asking for permission. I left the folder unopened. The phone rang again. Ethan, I answered. You okay? He asked, a voice low. Worried. Yes. You sure he's on every network now? This won't stay about the trial. I know. There was a pause. Then Ethan said, they're going to try to make this about you. About revenge, family drama. He's already planting that seed. Let them. He exhaled slowly. Camille, just be careful. He's not above using everything he has. He never was, I said. But this time, I'm not the one hiding. When the call ended, I went to the desk and opened my laptop. I didn't check the headlines. I didn't read the think pieces dissecting my silence. Instead, I opened a blank policy draft. Witness Power Protection Act, Preliminary Framework. The name had been sitting in a notebook for years, but I hadn't dared write it until now. The idea was simple protection for public figures, whistleblowers, and officials targeted through familial coercion or reputational manipulation. Not physical threats, emotional ones, legacy ones, the kind wielded over dinner tables and phone calls that never say what they mean. I typed steadily, clause by clause, provision by provision. No grand metaphors, just law. Because that was my weapon now, cold, unflinching, and built to last. As I worked, a memory surfaced. Anthony, years ago, standing in our father's study, still in his bar exam suit. He had smiled that calculated smile and said, "You'll never be anything that walks into my courtroom without shame." That sentence had become a knot in my throat for years. Now it was fuel. Midnight passed. The city outside quieted into neon hush. I finished the initial draft and emailed it to my legal advisor. No subject line, just one line in the body. They used our bloodline like a badge. "I'll make sure it's labeled hazardous." I stood stretched and poured a glass of water. I didn't turn on the TV, but I heard it from the hallway. The voice, my brother's clear, defensive, still dipped in that same old ice. "She's trading our family name for applause," Anthony said. "For clout, for career. And it's disgraceful." I stood by the door. I didn't flinch. ChatGPT Danoy. They didn't apologize. They cooked dinner. The driveway was freshly swept as if anticipation had gathered in the dust. Light spilled from every window of the Reyes estate, warm and golden, casting long shadows across the porch where I used to sneak out at night. I stood still for a moment, feeling the echo of memory press against my spine. I wore black, quiet fabric, no jewelry, my hair tied back. I could hear my mother's voice, soft and practiced from years ago. "If you ever return, wear something quiet. Loud clothes make people uncomfortable." I never asked who the people were. Helen opened the door with a smile so rehearsed it almost seemed natural. "Camille," she said, eyes flicking to my shoulders, my shoes, my silence. "You look, well." I stepped inside. The air smelled of lemon polish, roasted poblano, and something far older, anxiety baked into tile grout and wood grain. "Dinner's almost ready," she added, already turning. The house hadn't changed. Same grandfather clock ticking from the hallway. Same portraits on the wall. Except now my face had been cropped out of the family photo on the staircase. Neatly done like an editorial cut. Not vandalism. They were all there. Richard stood by the fireplace, drink in hand, posture rigid. Anthony sat at the long dining table, hands folded neatly before him, the picture of a man who still believed in formality as defense. Aunts and cousins milled about, performing familiarity. "Camille," someone exclaimed too brightly. "Still remember how to fold napkins into swans?" I smiled without showing teeth. I stopped bending myself into shapes years ago. That earned a few nervous chuckles. They seated me in my old spot, third chair from the left under the chandelier. The leather had been reupholstered, but the indent from my elbow still knew me. Dinner began with silence disguised as grace. Helen poured wine. Richard asked if I remembered my third-grade science fair project. Someone mentioned my campaign poster's clean design. No one brought up the courthouse, or the headlines, or Anthony. We spoke of recipes, of weather, of childhood, until we didn't. Helen set down her fork, folded her napkin once precise, and looked at me. "You've done well for yourself," she said, tone soft but deliberate. "We're proud, truly." I said nothing. Richard cleared his throat. "This family's name still means something. To us. To the state." Anthony's eyes didn't lift from his plate, but his knuckles whitened. Helen reached across the table, stopping short of my wrist. "Maybe you could speak to the prosecutor? Nothing formal. Just a word. For Anthony. Family matters." There it was. The ask wrapped in linen and served with mole rojo. I picked up my wineglass, then set it down untouched. My utensils rested gently on the plate. The sound of metal on ceramic echoed like a stone dropped into still water. I looked around the table, at my mother, rosary tucked discreetly under her sleeve, at my father, the ex-chief who still believed authority could be polished, at Anthony, who once whispered to reporters and now waited for mercy he wouldn't name. "If I weren't the governor," I said quietly, Would I even be your blood? No one answered. Not even the chandelier dared to hum. I stood. Behind me, the leather of my chair groaned against the silence, an unspoken gavel falling at the end of a farce. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't need to. They couldn't beat me in court. So they leaked the past instead. It started with a single ping, then another, then 100. By the time the second wave of notifications hit, the governor's office felt less like a seat of power and more like a digital battlefield, every screen alight with headlines that pulsed like open wounds. Grainy video resurfaces. Governor Reyes identified exclusive spring break scandal from the past. Haunts Colorado's rising star who was behind the camera, who wasn't. I stared at the footage in silence. The resolution was terrible. Blurry, pixelated, but unmistakable. My face. My body. A boy with a phone and too much entitlement. A moment I never consented to ripped from me, reassembled by strangers for consumption. Again. My staff crowded the room. Marion stood near the window, arms crossed. Ethan had sent 3 texts. Saw it. Here if you need. Don't let them take your name again. The head of comms was already dialing attorneys. We can demand takedowns, cease and desist, file injunctions. Every platform has a moral clause. Another voice. We prep a counter story. Make it about consent. Make it emotional. Maybe a sit-down interview. I didn't move. She should issue a statement. Take control of the narrative, someone said. I don't think she wants to talk right now, another replied. But I did. Just not the way they expected. I turned from the screen, closed my laptop, and walked to the glass wall behind my desk. Denver shimmered outside street lamps. Neon signs, high-rises caught mid-blink. I could see the edge of the Capitol dome glowing like a promise no one believed in anymore. They want me humiliated, I said, voice low but unshaken. They want me back in that place. Curled, silent. Everyone stopped. I'm not going, I continued. Let them look. I've survived worse. Someone cleared their throat. Governor, respectfully. Silence implies guilt. I turned. No. Silence implies control. I walked to the press secretary and took the folder from her hands. This scandal, it's not my shame. It's theirs. What they did then. What they're doing now. I'm not hiding it. I'm naming it. That evening, instead of crisis control, we called a press conference. The room was packed. Reporters shoulder to shoulder, cameras twitching. No teleprompter. Just a podium and a single spotlight. I stepped up. No questions, I said. Not yet. I looked out over the crowd and began. Yes, that video was real. Yes, it was me. No, I didn't authorize it. And no, I'm not here to explain the choices made by others years ago with a phone and a grudge. Click. Click. Shutters snapped like bones. You already know what shame looks like. But here's what survival looks like me. I lifted a sheet of paper. This is the Witness Power Protection Act. It proposes safeguards for those targeted by family-based intimidation tactics, emotional coercion, media leaks, legacy threats. It criminalizes using private histories to dismantle public voices. Silence. Then a question shouted from the third row. Governor, are you suggesting your family is behind the resurfacing? I looked at the camera. I'm saying power doesn't scare me. Family and power without consequence does. The room erupted. By morning, the bill trended higher than the video. Online survivors came forward. Stories of revenge-seeking parents, jealous siblings, abusive partners who'd used shame as leverage. The phrase, "not their shame," started appearing beneath photos of teachers, nurses, even another city council member who had been forced out after a leak eerily similar to mine. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed in the office, the lights dimmed, reading every headline and not reacting. Until the phone rang. Unlisted. I picked up. A man's voice. Calm. Measured. Governor Reyes. Yes, I suggest you watch the background. Your father's been quietly requesting federal-level background vetting through third parties. Not for your office, on you. ChatGPT Denoy. I didn't come to forgive. I came to witness what guilt looks like in a hospital bed. The hallway to room 421 smelled like antiseptic and resignation. Pale green walls. Low fluorescent hum. A nurse nodded at me, eyes flicking from my face to the file in her hand, then quickly away. I didn't introduce myself. I didn't need to. Helen Reyes lay beneath a stiff white sheet, her skin nearly matching the color of the pillow. Her hair had thinned into gray threads, and tubes hissed at her side, the sound steady as breath but more mechanical. Machines blinked in place of comfort. The only light in the room came from a small lamp above her head, casting a pool of dull yellow. I stood there for a full minute before stepping in. Her hands, once so precise, folding laundry and rosaries, trembled lightly on the blanket. I remembered those hands, not warm, not cruel, just distant, like everything else in that house. She turned her head slowly. "Mija," she rasped, her voice barely a breath, brittle as tracing paper. I didn't answer. I pulled the chair beside the bed and sat, coat still on posture, upright. I didn't touch her, not at first. I let the quiet fill the space between us, thick as fog. There were no flowers, no visitors. A distant cousin had signed the intake form. She wasn't alone, but she had no one. The nurse returned, briefly adjusted a drip, and nodded at me again. "She's stable," she said softly. "Vitals are holding." I gave a tight nod. The nurse left. We were alone again. Helen's eyes opened, unfocused. "Is it true?" she whispered. "All those things. The video. The news I didn't answer. Because truth doesn't change when it's ignored." I reached into my bag and pulled out a small square canvas wrapped in brown paper. I unwrapped it slowly and placed it on the bedside table facing her. A woman, hair tangled by desert wind, stood alone in a storm. Her silhouette stretched long and sharp into a barren landscape. No title on the front, but I knew what it was called. Witness. Helen's gaze drifted toward it. Her lips parted slightly. "You painted this?" she asked, barely audible. I nodded once. She closed her eyes, tears slipping out sideways. "I didn't see you," she said. I spent so long not seeing." I reached over and took her hand. It felt smaller than I remembered, the bones more pronounced, the pulse faint but present. I didn't grip it tightly. Just enough for her to know I was there. "This isn't forgiveness," I said quietly. "It's peace. On my terms." Her lips moved again. I didn't catch the words. Maybe they weren't meant for me. Maybe they were prayers. Or regrets. Or echoes of instructions once barked into dinner tables and church pews. I stayed another 10 minutes. Long enough for her breath to steady. Long enough for her to drift into sleep. Then I stood. I didn't look back. In the hallway, my phone buzzed once. A message from an unknown number. "Anthony, we need to meet. Just us." He didn't ask me to forgive him. He asked me to strategize. The cafe was almost empty. One barista behind the counter, stacking lids, one elderly man reading a newspaper by the window, and yes. Denver was quiet that morning. The streets still dusted with frost, the city unsure of how to exhale after a week of headlines. Anthony sat at a corner table, back straight, suit impeccable, despite the tremor in his hands. The air between us was thick with years unsaid. 15 years of silence packed into a 15-minute meeting. I walked in without a coat, without a smile, without the softness people wear when they hope for closure. I sat across from him and placed nothing on the table. He looked older, but not worn. Just fraying. The kind of fray that starts at the edges of ambition and creeps inward when you start losing control of the narrative. "You look well," he said finally, eyes scanning me like I was still someone he needed to categorize. I didn't answer. He exhaled. "This isn't about apologies." "No," I said. "You're not the type." He glanced around the cafe, then leaned forward. "The press, they're out for blood now. I can't control the judges' committee and federal oversight circling like it's already a verdict." And I asked. "And you," he said slowly, "could fix this. If you wanted to." There it was. No frills, no sentiment. Just a favor dressed as logic. "Why me?" I asked. He blinked. I tilted my head. "Why not our father? Why not your former colleagues? Why me?" He looked down at his coffee, then back up. "Because you're the only one powerful enough to make this stop without a single press release." Silence. The truth hung there like something neither of us could afford to breathe too deeply. And I said, "Because you know I'm not petty." He didn't respond. I let the pause stretch until it snapped. "You know," I said when I first left, when you helped make sure I left, I thought I'd never outrun the shame. I thought surviving meant shrinking." His mouth tightened, but he didn't interrupt. And then I learned surviving meant becoming someone you didn't plan for, he stared. I leaned forward. Did you leak the clip, I asked? His jaw clenched. His eyes didn't move. Then yes, it landed with less impact than I expected. Maybe because I'd known. Maybe because, at some level, I was waiting for him to finally say it. You were becoming inconvenient, he said. Dad was already worried about your major. Mom kept asking why you never came to church. You weren't controllable. I didn't flinch. So you gave it to that reporter, I asked. No, I gave it to a friend who owed me a favor. He passed it on. You didn't think it'd break me, I thought it would end the noise, he said. I didn't expect you to build a megaphone out of it. I reached into my bag and pulled out a manila folder. Placed it on the table between us. No rush, no emphasis, just process. He didn't touch it. What's this, the Witness Power Protection Act, I said. It's being finalized now. He eyed it warily. I'm not naming you, I added. You're not worth the ink. He almost laughed but didn't. The sound caught in his throat. I stood. You didn't destroy me, I said. You just miscalculated what I'd become. He opened his mouth to respond. I didn't wait to hear it. I walked to the door, the folder still on the table, the title clear in bold, Protect Those They Silence. No hug, no warning, no retaliation. Just law waiting to be written. They used to introduce him as Your Honor. Now he couldn't say his own name without shaking. The courtroom in San Antonio buzzed like a storm caught behind glass. Reporters jostled for position. Microphones stretched like metal vines toward the defense table. The state seal above the judge's bench gleamed untouched by the weight it bore today. Anthony sat in a tailored suit that no longer looked like armor. His posture was straight, his chin lifted, but only just. From where I sat, I could see the tremble in his fingers as he adjusted his tie. Not nerves. Not exactly. Recognition. The trial had drawn national attention, the kind you can't pay for, the kind no publicist could spin. Misconduct. Evidence tampering. Abuse of power in an immigration case involving a minor. The language was sterile legal, but the subtext was filth. I hadn't planned to testify, but the subpoena arrived wrapped in formality and public consequence. This time, I didn't avoid the moment. I met it, step for step. They called my name after the second recess. I walked calmly past rows of cameras and took the stand. Please state your name for the record, the prosecutor said. Camille Reyes. Murmurs. Pens scratched across notepads. Screens lit up. Ms. Reyes, do you recognize the defendant? I do. In what capacity? He's my brother. That hush, that particular silence that only ever follows bloodlines turned brittle, settled over the room. They asked about the case, about the deportation order, the falsified timeline, the suspiciously vanished evidence. I answered with precision. Dates, facts. No venom, just truth, cool and sharp. Then came the inevitable pivot. Ms. Reyes, is it true that you were once involved in a family scandal of your own? I looked at the defense attorney. His tie was too bright, his confidence too brittle. If you're referring to the unauthorized release of private footage from my college years, yes, that occurred. Was the defendant involved? No comment. He blinked. Excuse me, I met his eyes. He confessed, privately, but not under oath. I won't speculate. That's for the court to determine. The judge shifted forward. And your current title, Ms. Reyes, I turned slightly, voice steady. Governor of Colorado. A beat. Then another. Silence, then flashes. The entire gallery stirred like a single exhale. Even the judge froze. Anthony's shoulders dropped a fraction. His jaw tightened. He looked down. It was the only moment he'd surrendered that day. When I stepped down from the stand, I didn't look back. Later that evening, my name topped every headline from CNN to blog threads in 7 languages. Governor Reyes delivers composed testimony against brother. From scandal to State House, the rise of Camille Reyes. My team gathered around a glowing screen. We could lean in, my press director said. Book interviews. Ride this wave. It's your moment. I sipped my water and turned from the headlines. No, I said. We will redirect it. Some names open doors. Others collapse when spoken aloud. The chamber was too bright. Fluorescent light bounced off polished desks, and unforgiving marble washing every wrinkle, every doubt into high-definition exposure. I stood alone behind the podium at the Colorado State House, no aides flanking me, no notes in hand. Just the click of cameras behind the press rail and the sound of breath being held in 6 different registers of expectation. This was not a confession. This was legislation. I looked at the lawmakers, men and women in suits that had survived 3 administrations, some nodding quietly, others stiff with the discomfort of public morality being dragged out from under their carpeted lives. My name is Camille Reyes, I began, and I stand here not as a scandal or a redemption arc, or the daughter of anyone, but as a legislator, speaking for those whose voices were buried beneath legacy and silence. A murmur. Ethan watched from the 3rd row, his hands folded tightly. Marion stood at the far edge, chin raised, her eyes wet but steady. Around them, immigrant advocates, civil rights attorneys, former public defenders, people who'd spent lifetimes trying to keep others from being folded and hidden in the margins. We don't always name what hurts us, I continued. Sometimes we're taught not to, out of loyalty, out of shame, out of the sheer exhaustion of being dismissed. A pause. I let it stretch. The Witness Power Protection Act is not just about whistleblowers or elected officials. It's about anyone whose past, especially one weaponized by blood, is used to silence them. Coercion doesn't always look like blackmail. Sometimes it looks like dinner invitations, like favors with strings, like reminders that you carry a family name too fragile for truth. The silence in the room wasn't emptiness. It was absorption. I didn't name Anthony. I didn't have to. The press already had. I raised the draft copy of the bill, clean, sharp bound in navy cardstock. This act ensures that legacy can no longer be leveraged against integrity. That silence is no longer the price of peace. I heard a whisper near the back. She's rewriting what bloodline means. Let them whisper. Let them listen. To those who ask why I'm doing this now, I said I'll say this. Some legacies are born in fire. Mine survived it. I placed the bill on the clerk's desk. There was no applause. Not yet. The vote came 15 minutes later. It passed the first round. Bipartisan. Narrow, but loud enough to echo through every press room in the state. I didn't wait for cameras to chase me down the steps. I left through the side exit coat, over one arm, the wind outside sharper than it had been that morning. The sky above Denver was thick with motion clouds rolling like tides. My phone buzzed once in my coat pocket. A text. Richard Reyes, we need to speak. One last time. He used to stand over me. Now he waited in line to be heard. The community center smelled like coffee that had been left too long on a burner. Folding chairs scraped across the linoleum floor as volunteers packed away signs and clipboards from the town hall I'd just finished. A child laughed somewhere down the hallway, the kind of laughter that didn't know the weight of names yet. I was halfway through stacking a stack of printed handouts when someone said softly behind me, "He's here." I didn't need to ask who. Richard Reyes stood just inside the door, dressed like a man trying not to be recognized. Slacks too stiff, jacket too formal for the setting. No badge on his chest today. No shadow of command. Just age settled in the lines around his mouth. He didn't speak right away. Just nodded toward an empty room off to the side. I followed him in without ceremony. No security, no aid, no microphone. Just 2 chairs and a table that had seen better years. We sat. He exhaled like someone who'd been holding breath for too long. "You're doing well," he said. I didn't answer. I saw the vote, he added. "The bill. You spoke well." Silence stretched between us. Then he tried again. This wasn't easy for your mother." I looked at him. "She made it easier than you think." He flinched just barely. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, eyes darting to mine and away. I didn't know how to fix what happened, he stopped himself, rephrased, how to make it bearable. For the family, for your brother, for the name, I corrected. He nodded once. Slow, heavy. "I was raised to believe silence was strength," he said. "No," I replied. "Silence is what cowards call discipline." He looked older than I remembered. The man who once pounded fists on dinner tables now sat as if the air itself had grown too heavy to stand under. "I wanted better for you," he offered. "You wanted easier," I said. "You wanted clean, palatable, something you could explain in a church bulletin." He opened his mouth, but I raised a hand. "You abandoned me with silence," I said. "Now use it to listen." And to his credit, he did. The room buzzed with nothing but the humming lights. A clock ticked too loudly on the far wall. Somewhere outside, a door closed. We sat for several minutes, no speech, no epiphany, just proximity and the ache of what had been refused for too long. At last he stood. "I never understood my daughter," he said, voice rough. I met his gaze. "That was always your choice." He didn't nod, didn't argue. He walked out. No handshake, no plea, no last attempt to pull me back into his idea of family. Just footsteps fading. I remained seated for a moment longer, staring at the spot he'd occupied. Then I whispered, not to him, not even to the room I see me now. "That's enough. I once fought to be heard." Now silence leaned in. The stage was small, no towering podium, no flags. Just a wooden stool, a low mic stand, and a backdrop painted in soft tones of blue and gray colors that hushed rather than announced. It was the kind of space designed for truth, not theater. The Civic Integrity Summit had drawn activists, students, policy wonks, and survivors from across the country. The program listed my talk simply, "Leadership After Betrayal." I stepped onto the stage wearing flats, not heels. No speechwriter, no entourage. Just a small pin on my lapel, a broken chain link barely visible. The room stilled the moment I took the mic. "I was once called a disgrace," I began. I was erased, then punished for reappearing. No gasps, no notes scribbled, just the quiet of collective recognition. "I'm not here to name names," I continued. "I've done that already in courtrooms and legislation, and most importantly in silence." Laughter soft and rueful rippled through the front row. "I've learned that power doesn't always scream. Sometimes it just listens." I spoke of policy, yes, but also of pressure, of what it means to carry a last name heavier than any title. To be born into a house where love had conditions and silence was currency. Legacy, I said, is often confused with inheritance. But I've inherited nothing I didn't have to rebuild from ash. Then I introduced the Public Kinship Clause, a bill, I explained, that allows public employees to disclose family connections that pose ethical risks without fear of retaliation, demotion, or political suicide. A murmur of approval. I paused, letting it settle. We cannot ask people to be honest in systems built to punish them for doing so. Applause began, not thunderous but rising, grown from nods, from closed eyes, from fists unclenching. I scanned the room, and my eyes landed on her. Second row end seat. Her hair grayer now pulled back, in the same tight bun I remembered. A tissue crumpled in one hand. Shoulders hunched as if the years she'd carried had finally grown too visible to hide. My mother. Teresa didn't speak. She didn't stand. But I saw her lips move. "I'm sorry." I held her gaze for only a moment, then returned to the crowd. "This isn't vengeance," I said softly. "It's architecture. I'm building something my past can't live in." The room rose quietly then, all at once. A standing ovation that felt like a held breath finally let go. As I stepped down, I noticed the front row. There, on a simple white chair, rested a folded name tag, reserved, "Who she used to be." It remained untouched. I didn't walk out for applause. I walked out because no one else needed to be burned by that house again. The community center in East Denver didn't have a podium. Just a folding chair circle, a whiteboard with 3 uncapped markers, and the scent of old coffee lingering in the air. The room wasn't full. Maybe 15 people, mostly teens, a few volunteers, and Ethan leaning quietly near the back wall with his arms crossed and eyes soft. No cameras, no handlers, no name tags. I'd asked for it that way. They introduced me as Camille. Not Governor, not Reyes, just Camille. A girl with a past and a spine. We sat in a loose half-circle, kids shifting in plastic chairs, their questions scribbled in spiral notebooks. One girl, maybe 16, asked about public policy like it was a language she was just starting to speak. A boy in a hoodie asked about making it out of a bad family, and then a hand rose near the back. a quiet teen with a sketchbook on his lap, knees bouncing with nerves. "How do you survive being cut off?" he asked, like, really survive it? I looked at him for a long second. "I stopped waiting to be invited back," I said. "That's how." A murmur moved through the room. Not approval, not applause, recognition. I didn't talk about Anthony, or Richard, or headlines, or hearings. I talked about reclaiming breath, about sleeping in safety, about how peace wasn't silence, but the absence of permission seeking. We wrapped after an hour. No one rushed me. No one asked for selfies. They just nodded their thanks, gathered their notes, and drifted out into the waiting dusk. I stayed behind a few minutes collecting empty paper cups and unread flyers from a nearby table. Ethan approached, handed me my coat. "You were quieter than usual," he said. "I didn't need to be loud," I replied. They were already listening. He smiled, then faded back into the hall. He understood. He always had. Outside light snow had begun to fall, the kind that melts before it touches the ground, but still softens the air. I walked alone past the bus stop, fingers curled around a paper coffee cup, the steam rising faintly like an echo that no longer haunted. On the bench, someone had left a folded newspaper. I glanced down as I passed. "Judge Reyes resigns amid ongoing ethics probe." I didn't read it. I picked it up, folded it again, and dropped it gently into a recycling bin nearby. Not out of spite. Not to erase. Just done. I walked farther into the evening, the city lights glinting against snowflakes too proud to stick. No headlines waited, no arms outstretched. Only the quiet. Only the sound of my own breath, my own steps. I smiled faint and full. It's done. And I walked on. Not lonely, just free. ChatGPT Danoy. In the quiet that followed her final step away, there was no applause, only the sound of a life reclaimed. Camille didn't win with rage or revenge, but by turning silence into structure and betrayal into law. When injustice is met with unwavering courage, the final verdict can echo through generations. Some legacies crumble under truth, while others are rewritten brick by brick, choice by choice. If this story moved, you don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and leave a comment below. Type 1 if you felt understood, or 2 if you still needed more.